the U.S.-Mexican border? Let's consider the oh no, I'm not to do that. Our speaker is Greg Custer. Greg is currently on the Lake Chapala Society Board of Directors. He continues to work in the international travel industry with a keen focus on Mexico. He worked for over a decade observing the front lines of immigration at the Los Angeles International Airport with three international airlines, receiving inbound international flights from Mexico, Central America, and Europe. While this experience ended over 30 years ago, studying Mexico for over 40 years and living here since 2015 have influenced his views on borders and immigration. Please join me in welcoming Greg.
Thank you, Kat. I appreciate you starting with an attempt at a little border humor to get us going this morning. Thank you for that. Good morning, everyone. Buenos dias. Great to see such a good turnout today. I've lived Lakeside since 2015 as a full-timer, and this is my first go at presenting at Open Circle, but I've always appreciated and respected this forum and how so many brave souls turn up each week to show up and argue their point. Mexico is my passion, and that includes time growing up adjacent to the border in the border buffer zone. And just like in Mexico, there's a 100-kilometer line that runs from the international border south into Mexico. There is a parallel line that runs 100 kilometers north into the United States. And if you've ever driven on the 5 freeway between San Diego and Los Angeles, for decades there was an immigration checkpoint right on the freeway, very near where I grew up in Orange County. So for me as a kid, Mexico was always sort of looming and sort of just out of reach to someone who grew up with a very Anglo, Southern California upbringing. I'm going to ask you folks 2 things this morning, if you'll help me. One is that you come to this presentation with an open mind, and the second thing is that you listen with a sense of humor, please. I'd also like to do some random polling this morning. This is voluntary, of course, but I think if we could get a show of hands on some of these topics, if you choose to participate, I believe it'll give us some insight into this very special place, this very special Open Circle community, and maybe challenge some of your long-held beliefs. Free to participate, it's not mandatory. You can close your eyes if the polling becomes in any way too uncomfortable. Our home here in Ajijic is a very, very special and unique cultural space. And I think it's like any other place in all of Latin America. We're a village of around 12,000 Mexicans that's also home to around 4,000 permanent foreign-born residents. This is according to the 2020 census. Author Tony Burton, if you don't know Tony, you should. He's our local historian, has written 8 or 10 books that are all about Mexico, and his most recent book is one that came out a couple years ago that I highly recommend for you folks, called Foreign Footprints in Ajijic. It's available for sale at several outlets around town, and it's in the LCS library. But one of the things that Tony points out in this book is how that we may be the most cosmopolitan village anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. Now, the key word there being village, because we're a small setting, but we have, according to what he writes and statistics that the Lake Chapala Society has produced, people from over 30 different countries living in this small village. Really remarkable. And so, as such, it always makes me chuckle also to hear how that uniqueness of our community has allowed people to put labels on us living here too. So one of the labels that's been put on us, which I think is kind of funny, is that we've been called a colony, like we should all be carrying muskets or something, marching on the malecon with little hats on or something. So I'm not sure where that term came from, but in fact, the newspaper that we all read on Friday afternoons when it comes out, the Guadalajara Reporter, was for years and years called the Colony Reporter. And if you haven't seen this week's issue, there's a really fun story about the fact that this month, December, is the 60th year anniversary of this chronicle being produced. So if you don't have this issue, pick it up, it's fun. Is Dale Palfrey here? Okay, she didn't make it today. But we have, wonderful chronicles that are happening about living Lakeside. And a lot of it is thanks to this. And the fact that they've been around for 60 years is really pretty remarkable. The other one I love is someone once characterized us living here as the island of misfit toys. And if you're from the US, you may remember that from the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer cartoon. But it does sort of characterize the reasons we come here, why we stay, and to some extent how we connect with our Mexican neighbors. I also want to respect the fact that this topic, the US-Mexican border and borders in general, is a lightning rod for very emotional expressions from estadounidenses, canadienses, extranjeros, and especially Mexicans. As I developed today's talk and asked foreign-born and Mexicans their opinions about migration, it revealed how this topic is sort of like taking an inflated balloon and trying to hold it with ice picks, okay? Because a lot of people go to their sort of ideological mothership with very strong views on borders and immigration. So what I'd like to attempt to do today is try and gently hold this balloon and not have emotional and long-held beliefs blow up the whole discussion. So let's see if we can do that this morning, okay? Great. It's very likely that most of us are leaning, if not fully endorsing, one of two views about immigration and borders. And one of those views is open borders. The other view is let's build a wall. I'm not saying we're in those camps completely, but we may be leaning one way or the other on that. A similar and related view might be that flowing across the southern border, so heading into Mexico, is mostly good things, like us, right? And flowing north from Mexico, Central America, into the United States, there's sometimes some bad things. So there also has to be ample room in this discussion for the viewpoints of our Mexican neighbors and their views on nationhood, on racism, migration, and historical realities. And it's a topic best expressed by a Mexican and not me. And the final perspective I think we all need to bring into this discussion is the fact that we have perspectives that surface by living here, how we navigate our daily bicultural existence, or choose not to. All of us, to some degree, live in a cultural bubble. I watch way too much college football, and I'm sure we all have tendencies to stay, tied to U.S. or Canadian or overseas media, and we do other things to create a comfort level here that is not really part of a full integration into living in Mexico or living overseas. My purpose here today is not to attack, defend, or insult your views on migration, but I do want to take a provocative stance in asking this unique audience of foreigners and Mexicans living side by side to perhaps reassess certain assumptions about our hyper-connected and hyper-conflicted 21st century world. My title today is A Time to Move the US-Mexico Border. Okay, that's pretty provocative, but let's be honest. I'm not really going to answer that question or propose a physical move of the 2,000-mile line that divides us. I hope to illuminate whether the Western Hemisphere can continue with the current dysfunctional border, and most importantly, do we have the imagination to foresee a better future for the Western Hemisphere and the Americas? Ready to start?
Ready.
Okay, let's do a little poll. Here's poll number one. Raise your hand if you are an immigrant.
To Mexico?
Okay, I'm going to define migrant. Immigrant is, quote, a person who moves from one place to another, especially in order to find work or better living conditions. Can I ask for that poll again? Okay, very good. Okay, now ask you a second question. Raise your hand if you consider the right to migrate a fundamental human right. Okay, now keep your hand up. I'm going to modify that statement just quickly here. If I added the words legally migrate, would more hands go up? Yes. Okay, interesting. I'd love to spend today's talk on the fascinating history of the US-Mexico border. Time won't allow this, but I can highly recommend a book called Line in the Sand for anyone interested. But we really can't talk about the current situation between the United States and Mexico border without addressing sort of how did we get here, right? This is a topic that just won't go away, and it's just in our face all the time if you're paying any attention to Mexican and US and international media right now. Some basic border facts, though, are kind of a good place to start. First of all, the US-Mexico border stretches for 1,954 miles. That's 3,145 kilometers from the Pacific to the Gulf of Mexico. So basically think San Diego to Brownsville, Texas. It's the 10th longest international border anywhere in the world, and most would agree it's the demarcation with the greatest level of socioeconomic disparity anywhere on the planet. And it's part of the reason why the relationship between the United States and Mexico is oftentimes categorized as being distant neighbors. A great book written in the 1980s about this by that title. It's legally crossed every year by over 350 million times. Legally crossed. That's a statistic from 2010. So today, there are over 1 million daily crossings of the US-Mexico border, almost always for needs serving commerce, familial ties, and tourism. The vast majority of this line, over 1,200 miles of this demarcation between the US and Mexico, is based on rivers. One of them being the Rio Grande, which, by the way, in Mexico, it's not the Rio Grande, it's the Rio Bravo, is the name used, and a portion of the Colorado River. Now, this may have seemed like a really good idea back in the 1840s, but it's a real problem today to use a river as a demarcation of an international border, especially with so much activity happening. Why? Because rivers do what? They move. Does anyone know the last time the US-Mexico border was moved? The line was actually legislated to be moved? Well, it was in 2009 when the two nations got together because the river had shifted. And there's some bizarre things that happen when the river moves too, and people in land and property that was once in one country all of a sudden finds out it's not anymore. So the border is being moved on a regular basis. So let's agree that the unique challenges of this line are not easily resolved in a way that serves both nations. And in learning more about border history, we can point to some watershed moments on both sides, the United States and Mexico, of this shifting line of water, sand, and urban clusters that make up the border. And I want to emphasize this urban cluster concept. There are 14 giant urban areas that exist right on the line. I mean, the line is literally right here. And one side is the United States, the other side is Mexico. And the fact that you have these urban zones existing in such close proximity creates a number of significant challenges. If the border were a line drawn in the middle of nowhere, the situation would be greatly simplified, but that's not the reality we face. The US-Mexico border, as many of you know, was the result of some interesting historical forces. One of them being the expanding US national experiment of becoming a nation, and the other one was a 19th century Mexico that was coming out of 300 years of Spanish colonial rule. So one nation, the United States, was projecting strength, growth, expansion, while the other was barely able to field a national government and even less prepared to stake any sort of territorial limits on this vast expanse of land that was almost geographically unfathomable. Mexico had no ability whatsoever to, in fact, enforce any kind of territory borders. It was barely existing through most of the 19th century to put a federal government in place. A war ensued, as many of you know, and Mexico was coerced into selling half of its physical territory, and just years later sold another block of land to the US because the US needed more land to build railroads through what is today New Mexico and Arizona. So it wasn't just the war, it was subsequent to that another negotiation that peeled off another large chunk of southern New Mexico and Arizona called the Gadsden Purchase, which is where the borderline exists today across that stretch of land. Surprisingly, once the actual line was jointly agreed upon, and it's a fascinating story about how this happened. So you have some, basically politicians deciding a parallel where this line was going to be, but then someone had to go actually on the ground and decide where the heck is this. And joint teams between the United States and Mexico spent 7 years on expeditions trying to figure out where the hell are we going to demark this line in this vastness of nothing. And the original markers that were put down were over 100 miles apart. Okay, now what is that really putting any sort of, configuration on? So it was a big, big challenge just to get through gullies, over rivers, mountains, deserts, no access to water, native tribes very hostile to the whole process, and it took 7 years to just kind of have an idea of where this line was going to be, in fact, drawn. Both nations jointly also confronted the fact that there was still a very pressing threat when this border was created, and that is Apaches and other sovereign nations living in this territory continue their autonomy by moving freely between a meaningless line in the sand. It was not until the 1880s that the United States and Mexico jointly quelled this threat to Anglo and Mexican settlements at the expense of people for whom borders were utterly meaningless. So you get the war in the 1840s. It wasn't until the 1880s that finally both countries working together could claim that they had some sort of control or the beginnings of a demarcation. Now there are 3 other historic eras that need to be touched upon briefly in this fascinating history of the United States and Mexico. The first is the period 1910 to 1920, which corresponds to the Mexican Revolution and the United States' entrance into World War I. These were profoundly important to the efforts to regulate and control what had been a comparatively free and cooperative flow of people and commerce. U.S. investment moved into the western border with mining, ranching, and railroads. And because we're talking about the western border here, there's no rivers to deal with because the Rio Grande is primarily in Texas and into New Mexico. The line just didn't really matter very much. But the Mexican Revolution and World War I created new hostilities and vulnerabilities for both nations. So you had guns flowing south into Mexico, and you had some free passage being afforded to Mexican rebels who were fighting, much of the Mexican Revolution was fought in northern Mexico. You had refugees and contrabands coming north, escaping the ravages of a 10-year Mexican Civil War. There was also an exposed plan by the German government to enlist Mexico's entrance into World War I in exchange for Germany helping Mexico recover the land lost by Mexico to the United States. It's called the Zimmermann Telegram, and it was intercepted, but this was an attempt by the Germans to establish a new front in World War I right on the US border, and then, we'll win that land back for you if you fight on our side. So a lot of suspicion, and when you have bullets flying across the border, contraband, refugees, this highlighted the need for some sort of demarcation that was going to have some meaning to it. The second critical tipping point was how the US morality police, began closing Americans' access to vice. And this started around alcohol, principally, and expanded to other vices. But in response to the prohibition laws of 1920 to 1933, we all remember that, right? American capitalists, never making a good chance to cash in on an opportunity, established these vice way stations, basically, for prostitution, drinking, gambling, contraband, that fell just outside the sovereignty of the US government, And it started where? Where specifically? Tijuana. Welcome to Tijuana. Tequila, sex, and marijuana. If you know that song, that Manu Chao song? It started in Tijuana and eventually spread to outposts for lascivious, immoral behavior by Americans. And try as it may, the US was powerless to stop Americans' demand for vice. Sound familiar? Now, there's another kind of funny story about this period as well. This is for you Canadians in the audience. During Prohibition, there were some creative solutions to getting around how the thirst for alcohol could be satisfied in a recreational setting. So, in Maine, where Maine meets New Brunswick, someone in the 1920s built a golf course. And they built the golf course specifically so that the parking lot and the clubhouse was in the United States, and the golf course was in Canada. Why? So you could go check in, get your tea time, and go on to the golf course and drink alcohol. And that worked beautifully for decades and decades until 2008, when the United States went into the zero tolerance and started focusing not so much on the southern border, but now on the northern border with Canada, and they shut that down. So now, if you want to go play that golf course, you have to drive 20 minutes, go through an immigration station, and then come around into the parking lot in the clubhouse, and you can go play the golf course. So it's not just the U.S.-Mexico border that's been impacted there. And so the third era, after this period of the revolution, you know, the morality being imposed. Oh, another little story about the morality imposition. You know, this happened mostly in the San Diego, Tijuana area, but the authorities there decided it'd be a good idea is to shut down the border at 9 o'clock at night. That'll stop all this vice, right? Because everyone's got to be back home and ready to go to church in the morning or something. Well, what did the capitalists end up doing? They invented the hotel industry on the border. So you just spend the night. What's the big problem? So there's always going to be, this friction, if you will, but some very creative responses in demand to the desire for vice that just doesn't seem to be waning. And then the third era I want to touch on is 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, swept the United States, Canada, and Mexico into an alliance that foretold a new future of integration and, yes, opening the border to the freer movement of products, services, and people. And you can hear the desire for openness in speech after speech up until even early 2001 from Vicente Fox, the president of Mexico, from Jean Chrétien, the Prime Minister of Canada, and yes, even George W. Bush. You go back 20 years before, in the early 1980s, when you had Ronald Reagan competing as a presidential candidate, and he repeatedly, in public statements, falls over himself embracing immigration and embracing inviting Mexicans to become part of American society and open immigration. And it's Ronald Reagan who in 1983 passed the most sweeping amnesty bill, giving 3 million Mexicans who were living in the United States a path to residency and a path to citizenship. Now, we can't imagine, and that's not part of the Ronald Reagan legacy, but it's a reality, an indication of how 40 years later, how did we get where we are today? But of course, this openness and this idea all changed with September 11th. After September 11th, the US government went into a zero-tolerance immigration and border strategy that really torpedoed many of the concrete efforts tied to globalization's full realization. So up until 2001, the world was really in sort of a golden age of globalization, right? Ironically, the globalization story portended its greatest vulnerability. Globalization integrated products, people, and services across the planet, okay? But this integration generated extraordinary social, economic, political, criminal, and environmental disruption. And the very thing that made globalization possible, which is this low-friction movement of ideas, people, commerce, services, was also highly vulnerable to this new world order of conflict. And today, you can argue the US-Mexico border remains profoundly impacted by the debate about openness versus shutting down. Let's turn to today's reality and what's happening at this line in the sand and across the world. According to the United Nations, some 281 million people are living outside their birth countries in the year 2020. We have to believe that number has gone up dramatically since then. The UN also estimates that there are some 110 million displaced humans all living in a state of flux, with their home countries uninhabitable. Could be due to climate change, persecution, political conditions, crime, all sorts of war and conflict. Refugees are exercising a basic human right to migrate. And this could in fact apply to the person sitting next to you. Remarkably to me, of the 11 million illegal aliens in the United States, it's estimated that some 5 million of these people are simply people who arrived legally in the United States and overstayed their visa. So we have this image of these hordes of people coming in the United States illegally and not going home. In fact, nearly half of the people are people who legally migrated and stayed. And I love, there was a comedian in the 1990s who had a solution to this problem. Okay, does everyone remember Blockbuster Video?
Yeah.
I happen to come from by this town in the United States that has the one remaining Blockbuster video store anywhere on the planet Earth, Bend, Oregon. Okay? But a comedian came up with a plan. He said, you know what? We can fix this visa problem. All we have to do is put Blockbuster Video in charge of enforcement. Because you're one day late returning that VHS tape, and they are all over your ass. Of course, that policy wasn't adopted, but it's still amazing to me that that's the major block of people living in the United States. They came to the United States legally. Okay. What's also astonishing to me is that how the who and why of migrants showing up at the US-Mexico border has changed dramatically in recent years. Today, the largest national groups presenting themselves at this border are from 4 different countries: Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. None of these groups have played much of a historic role at that line in the sand. But that's not all. Turning up at the US-Mexico border are Eastern Europeans and Africans. Now, some of these cases of Africans, these are people who are flying into Brazil, crossing the Amazon jungle, coming up through Central America, and arriving at this line between our 2 countries. And all these groups are bringing children. And in 2022-23, the number of Chinese at the border has shot up to over 24,000. That's more than the last 10 years combined. So what is going on here? Finally, we must, I think, explore the local situation. And as a community of migrant invaders who live side by side in village settings for over 8 decades, and where attitudes between foreigners and village residents are a fascinating, to me anyway, laboratory of interpersonal and transactional engagements. And you don't have to go far in Ajijic to encounter borders. And I'd like to point to 3 examples I find very interesting. The first one being is that foreigners, majority of us here, we could stand up right now, walk out the door, go to the airport, get on an airplane, and go essentially anywhere in the world we want to. And that's not the case with our Mexican neighbors, mostly because of passports, visas. To go to the United States right now, a Mexican will wait for over a year just to get an appointment, spend hundreds of dollars to get that visa appointment, and very likely are going to be turned down with no explanation and no returning of the money. By the way, to go to Canada, I just found this out the other day, there is no visa, but you have to fill out an online form. It's never turned down if you have a valid passport as a Mexican, and it costs $7. So a very different reality for Mexicans who want to go to the United States with a passport or go to Canada with a passport. So that to me is kind of a line. We have that freedom that our Mexican neighbors do not have, and that's another form of a border. We also live our daily lives at an immigration crossroads, playing out at topes, speed bumps, along the carretera. This is more obvious during COVID, but it's still here even today. Take a closer look, and you'll see that most days we come face to face with people who are migrants moving north or returning to their nation of origin through Mexico. We're the foreigners here who have settled in. They are on an arduous, dangerous task, but we share momentarily at that speed bump a common bond. We're all migrants. And I saw a beautiful little vignette of that just yesterday. I was walking in front of the Walmart debacle, and there's a family unit, father, son, and a young child who's there on a regular basis. They're not Mexicans, they're from Central America. And they were standing there putting Christmas ornaments on a bush that they stand by to wash windows from cars passing by. So we have this unique, it's another example of how this crossroads here creates a very special community here that doesn't really exist anywhere else, I don't think. And my third example is just steps away from where we sit today. There are imaginary lines. And many of the folks who who host us, who put up with us, who benefit financially from us living here, also feel uncomfortable and somewhat unwelcome entering certain physical spaces, like LCS and other community locations. LCS volunteers and staff see this almost every day. And I work at the front gate on Friday afternoons, and I observe this, and many of you volunteers are here as well. As Mexican locals and Mexican visitors will approach our front entrance and hesitate to come in. Happens all the time. Or when village vendors stand outside our entrance at open circle and don't enter. Now, LCS is actively addressing this dynamic with volunteer training, signage, offering tours, and all the other things that were mentioned earlier, scholarships for Mexican kids, English classes, joint events with area nonprofits, and so much more. And it's one reason I really encourage you all to become active members of this hosting organization. One final poll, raise your hand if you're currently an active LCS member. Outstanding. Bravo to you all. In closing, some personal observations. If history has taught us anything, it's that international borders are always changing. And many of today's global conflicts are the result of lines imposed on people that just don't work. History and Humpty Dumpty teach us that great walls are not great answers. Walls, barriers, fences, oceans, rivers, mountains, deserts can never stop human migration because they all succumb eventually to humanity's most basic motivation for crossing lines, and that is economic self-interest. Although very powerful political symbols, fences are not the most effective way to deal with problems of drug trafficking and undocumented migration. My next observation is that the United States and Mexico are much better served in a 21st century by actions that unite and integrate our economies, our culture, and our societies. Both the United States and Mexico, we want the same thing. We want peace, we want security, and we want international trade. And innovative response to the border quagmire could become the economic engine and social justice solution for our binational mid-20th century connectedness around a north-south hemispheric future. Okay? We are today all Americans in the hemisphere that's far more connected north to south than it was generations ago when European immigration dominated much of American culture. Today, that has changed. The United States and its southern neighbors are becoming far more integrated, not just economically, but also socially. If your grandparents, when was the last time you went to a birthday party in the United States that didn't involve soccer and piñatas?
Yeah.
You know, the change is here, and it's only going to get stronger, and the sooner we embrace that connectivity, the better the hemisphere is going to be. I also believe that most opposition to migration, aside from the US legacy of racism, relates fundamentally to a fear of loss. And it comes down to the size of the pie. Everyone understand what I talk about when I say the pie? The pie is all the good stuff, right? And for many in the US and in Mexico, more people coming to live in their home country means a smaller piece for me. So there's a lot of fear associated with the concept of free movement of people. And the fact is that's just not true. Because why? The pie is always getting bigger. That's the thing. It's not one pie being shared by more and more people. The pie gets bigger. The US economy in the year 2000 was about a $13 trillion economy. In 2023, it's going to probably hit $27 trillion. So the pie is always getting bigger, and the same is true in Mexico. For the US and Mexico, inbound immigration is sort of a secret weapon, okay? It's bringing people to the US or to Mexico to see what it's really like. And the ones that stay enrich the United States and Mexican society and have the possibility to make extraordinary contributions. And the ones who go back take the United States and Mexico values with them. How can that be a bad thing? And any US effort at isolating Mexico, invading Mexico, stopping commerce and stopping human connections do not serve US or Mexican interests. Similarly, Mexico's actions in this crisis are often unacceptable, allowing refugees from across the planet to freely cross its territory without any basic service being provided, denying a migrant his or her legal right to be here or the right to work, and then being negligent about safety from predatory government officials and criminal gangs is not sustainable for Mexico's interests. So there are responsibilities here on both sides, clearly. And I'll finish today with two quotes. The first comes from the book that I've cited called A Line in the Sand, where the author Rachel St. John says the following, quote, "The history of the borderline has shown that the border can mean many things, a customs and immigration checkpoint, and a divide between political and legal regimes, but also a site of transborder exchange and community formation and a place that people call home. The border has not always been a barrier, and there's no reason to think that it will not become something else in the future." End quote. And finally, for our US citizens in the audience today, there's this. Abraham Lincoln, keeps coming up here, I don't understand why that is. Abraham Lincoln said in a speech almost 200 years ago the following, not about immigration, but about the existential threat that was facing the United States before the Civil War. And Abe Lincoln said this, quote, "At what point then is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer that if it ever reaches us, it must spring from amongst us. It can never come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we ourselves must be authors and finisher."
Wow.
Thank you very much.
Ooh, that was so good. This is where it gets tricky. Okay. I want you to be as good as he. I can imagine that some of you would like to spout your viewpoints very strongly, or maybe disagree with him in some way, though he's made it almost impossible to. So really what this time is about asking questions. So we maybe like to learn more, what he's thinking, what he's learning, what he discovered, and so much of that. Now, if anybody goes into any kind of controversial stuff, I'm going to take the mic, because that's not what we're here for. As wonderful as it would be to spout, I believe, please don't. Ask questions, raise your hand, I'll bring a mic.
When can he come back?
When can he come back? Okay. Soon, as soon as he wants, I think. Okay, I'm coming to the back.
Would you consider giving some kind of a seminar here to discuss this in more detail? I find the topic absolutely fascinating.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, look, you guys, I would love to do that. As I said, Mexico is my passion. I'm not an authority on this subject, but I do have, these 40 years working in the travel industry and working in Mexico, and so I have ideas, and I just love observing things in this community, and I just spot things. I think sometimes we can all get caught in sort of this cycle of, how come they don't, and why don't they, and well, but there's so many little things here that are just treasures of cultural connectivity that if we just spend a little more time observing and then sharing those observations, I think we become a much richer place. But yeah, I want to teach more here at LCS, and hopefully maybe I'll offer some courses in 2024. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Angel Cabrera. I was one of the beneficiary of the amnesty program of the Ronald Reagan. So you're right, there's so many Mexicans that they overstay in the United States. Okay, they go with the visa and they overstay. Okay, do you have any statistics on how many expats overstay here too?
Good question.
Bravo, bravo. Well, the thing is, no, and the other thing that kind of makes me chuckle is when it continues to be written that we are the largest colony of Americans living outside the United States. Well, that's baloney, okay? There are more, just to say if you're a holder of a US passport, you're a US citizen, right? But there's probably 10 places in Mexico that have way more US citizens living than we do, starting with every city on the border. Guadalajara, you guys, there's 5 million people there. You don't think you can find 10,000 US citizens living in the city of Mexico City. So that's just fallacy. But yeah, the ones who are overstaying have no idea. There's not even a clear number as to how many of us are living here, because it's a hard thing to count, and Mexico gives us very liberal 60 days. And if we stay, let's face it, it's 25 bucks at the airport when you leave. No big deal. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you so very much. You know, this gave us a lot of very interesting information. And I just want to make the remark that I am Mexican, okay? We are not distant friends. Sorry, distant neighbors. We are close friends. And you know that Mexicans do love Americans, and I think that most of the Americans here love Mexico, so we can all help, you know, to create this lovely environment between all of us and to enjoy, you know, the time here. We are here to enjoy life, and I think he brings so much beautiful things. So thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Magnificent, thank you. What guidance can you give us about approaching the people at the topes and Walmart?
Well, approach it with thinking with your heart and not your head. And for me, it's very clear to me, and I don't say this in any sort of discriminatory undertone, but it's very clear to me when someone is really on the move as a migrant and someone who's just, you know, someone in the community who lives here and needs some help. It's pretty easy to spot these people. And in my world, I'm more generous with people who I know are migrants and they're on a journey and they just happen to be here. You know, just how would you find your way to here? A lot of people are flowing through Guadalajara because some of you know there's a train called La Bestia that starts down in Chiapas that every day is bringing hundreds of women, children, men clinging to the exterior, finding, you know, sitting on top in this rail journey that comes right through Guadalajara and continues north to the border. That's happening every day, and there are giant migrant camps in downtown Guadalajara. But some of those people find their way to this little stretch of highway. And when I spot those people, I'm as generous as I can be, or stop and talk to them. You know, it's amazing how many of them speak English too. Because some of these people are coming from Honduras and from Belize. Of course, Belize, the language is English. A lot of Hondurans and Central Americans have very advanced English skills. So you're not even going to have that barrier to stop you from engaging one-on-one with these people. Yes?
On December 22nd, they're having a Mexican posada at Casa del Sol. And then you can have all the tamales you want. And then they're going to have music.
Okay, I guess she's saying we're all invited. At the where did you say? At the Casa del Sol, the 25th. And what is it? 22nd. I'm not saying anything right. It's 22nd at what time?
At 5 o'clock.
At 5 o'clock, and you're saying everybody's welcome.
Yeah, you pay for it.
You pay for it. You buy your tamales, etc. Okay.
Can you comment on the comparison between the migration of the Europeans and the migration of the Latin American and Mexican communities today? I mean, it seemed like it was much more organized in those days, and of course 9/11 put the kibosh on things. But I think doing a study on comparing the migration of the Europeans and the migration of Mexicans could be interesting.
Yeah. When you say migration of Europeans, meaning within Europe, migrations from countries into Europe? Yeah. Well, here's another fascinating thing. You know, the Americas, the Western Hemisphere, has an extraordinary advantage if your idea is to put up barriers. One of them is called the Pacific Ocean. The other one's called the Atlantic Ocean. The entire landmass of the rest of the planet, you can walk from Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Europe. They're all physically connected. You can just, with your 2 feet, move across this landscape. But to come here, you have to cross these gigantic barriers. So, you know, that definitely flavors the, you know, how migrants move. But the fact that the extraordinary one for me is still people coming from Western Africa into Brazil and finding their way thousands of miles through a very arduous journey across this vast wilderness to come to this line. Just extraordinary. And it's not going to stop anytime soon.
Anybody else? Okay.
I was amazed at your saying, that the border, most of the people coming up through there are not Mexicans, but other countries. Is there any data on that at all?
Well, in fact, that's not maybe necessarily true. There was a period from 2005 to 2015 where net migration from Mexico went down. More Mexicans were leaving the United States than were coming into the United States. Now that has changed again. But what is interesting to me today is what's showing up at the border. There's basically two cohorts. One cohort is the people who say, I'm going to come and I'm just going to sneak into the United States because I have familiar ties, I know where I'm going to go, I've been working there, I'm going to start a new life under that fashion. The other big group is the one who cross over the line and just say one word, asylum. And that's what's happening more and more today, and that immediately will give these migrants essentially instant access. They're all carrying a phone number of a contact that they have in the United States, families, friends, and they're put into the queue for that asylum interview. That asylum interview can take up to 5 years, and they are given the right to legally work and live in the United States during that period. And it could be another 5 years of a transition to appeal that. So the whole question of asylum, and a lot of Mexicans are not coming to the United States for asylum. They were coming, and they still do come because of narco violence and things like that, but most of the people are now coming from across the planet. And so the United States, I think, is going to have to eventually come up with some form of adjustment to that, because if you walk through 5 countries, you're seeking asylum for the country you live, and you don't apply for asylum in any of those 5 countries that you went through, are you saying the United States is the only place on the planet Earth that can give you relief? And I think that's what we're going to see very soon, as on the news this morning. There's going to be a new bipartisan rule that's going to change that asylum and say, look, you have to have applied in another country before you come to the United States. The United States can't be the only refuge for political asylum. So those are things, but it's fascinating. It's changing every day. It's changing. Yes?
I'm sorry, I arrived
Wait. I know you probably have a great loud voice, but
I just wanted to know if you have a book that you've written about this topic.
Not at all.
not yet.
No.
Isn't that your answer? Not yet.
Not yet. Thank you, Kat.
Oh, I got one more. Okay.
You think it was loud for you? Because that's what it was like for me.
I just wonder, I live in Louisville, Kentucky, and I used to volunteer with Kentucky Refugee Ministries. They would bring in political refugees from all over the world, and it's been a few years since I volunteered with them, but as I understood things, the State Department will give an agency such as Catholic Charities Immigration and Kentucky Refugee Ministries $950 per political refugee when they arrive in the country. They get a green card, Medicaid, food stamps, Section 8 eligibility. And it's really a struggle for a single person to make it. And I know a good friend of mine is Cuban and came from Santiago de Cuba 15 years ago, and with his family, 5 of them. And it's a big transition for a lot of people. They think that as soon as the streets are paved with gold, and they're not.
Yeah.
But what is the situation with the financial assistance from the U.S. government towards political refugees?
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that. I know a lot of it is charitable, but also there's a lot of federal, state, municipal funds. That's why this shipping migrants from city to city and then having them show up on a bus, and the strains this is putting on major urban areas is part of one of the pressure points that's going to probably change the political flavor of this discussion, and very, very soon. I mean, I think this week there's going to be changes as to, especially how asylum seekers are being freely allowed into the U.S. Yeah.
Okay, that's it, everybody. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you.